Dividing zero by numbers is another set of facts that tends to be really tricky for all students. So here I have the strategy of dividing zero by numbers. The model is colored tiles. And I have a situation of Marcy wanted to give four of her friends an equal share of buttons. If Marcy had no buttons, how many could each friend receive? And so concretely, students might think about there being the four friends that Marcy wants to give an equal share of buttons to. But it turns out Marcy has no buttons. So how many could each friend receive? Well, they can't receive any because there aren't any to give a fair share for, right? So it's going to end up being nothing and zero. And then pictorially, if a student wants to enter it in this way, they might think about, okay, four friends. They could put four shapes to represent each of the four friends. But if Marcy has no buttons to give, how many could each friend receive? Well, they're going to end up having none. There aren't any for them to have an equal share of. And as we go to a tape diagram model, well, there are zero buttons for her to be able to share, which means that each person cannot get any, right? They're each going to get zero. So abstractly, we have this zero. We are dividing it by the four, but each person can only get zero. And again, we could be making sure that we're putting that zero on the left-hand side of the equal sign. That zero divided by four would be zero. And to be relating that also to zero divided by four can also mean four times something equals zero, which of course must be zero, not because it's a rule we told students, but because the students understand four groups of something must be the same as zero. Keeping the strategy and the model the same, but changing the context a little bit. In this quotative context, now I know the size of each group. I just don't know how many groups they're going to be in all. There's a bookshelf that could fit 5 books on a shelf. If there were no books on a shelf, how many full rows of books were there? So concretely, I can be imagining there being one shelf or one row, but there are no books. So there can't be any complete shelves. There's not any books on there at all. Pictorially, I might imagine there being a row, but again, I'm not going to have any books on a shelf at all. I also can think about this in terms of just a tape diagram model here, row one, but there's not even any books in there. And then abstractly, again, I have the zero. I'm dividing it by 5. And that turns out to be the same thing as zero. Also putting the zero on the left-hand side. Again, it looks unfamiliar to the students. That's why it looks tricky. But the more often they see it, the less tricky it will look for them. And also we can be relating this to the multiplication fact that 5 times something will give us 0. So 5 books on a shelf times some number of shelves would give us 0 books. Well, it must be 0 shelves.